What happens when Montreal's most feared crime lord walks into a quiet accounting firm and decides the full-figured bookkeeper in the back office is the funniest thing he's seen all week? He expected her to dissolve. Instead, Nadia Aurel, Instead, the woman who kept his rival's financial skeletons in a locked drawer made the untouchable Castian Vrel beg to hold her hand. The elevator in the Bernier building on St. Catherine Street West smelled like burnt coffee and other people's anxiety. Rosalie Fontaine had worked on the 14th floor long enough to know every personality in that building by their shoes. Loafers meant middle management pretending. Oxfords meant partners who hadn't smiled since 2009. Sneakers meant the IT guy who kept accidentally CCing the wrong clients. She wore wide-fit flats, size 9, because her feet swelled by Thursday, and she wasn't going to punish herself for it. Rosalie was 31. She stood 5'5" and carried herself in a way that took up as little space as possible, shoulders slightly curved inward, a habit she'd developed in high school, when being loud and large felt like the same sin. She had dark brown hair she kept pinned at the nape of her neck, warm amber eyes that missed nothing, and a brain that could reconcile a 7-figure discrepancy in under 40 minutes. Her colleagues at Bernier and Croft Financial Services called her quietly brilliant. Her mother called her pleasantly round. Rosalie called herself invisible, which was, for a long time, exactly what she preferred. She sat at her corner desk behind 2 monitors and a dying fern named Gerald, and she did not look up from her spreadsheets when new clients came in. That was what the reception area was for. That was what Teo at the front desk was for. Rosalie's job was the numbers. The numbers were clean, reliable, and never commented on her body. The Thursday morning that everything changed smelled like February in Montreal, road salt and regret. Rosalie had just caught a suspicious outflow in a client's quarterly filing and was 3 seconds from confirming it when the glass doors of Bernier and Croft swung open with the kind of authority that made the entire open-plan office go quiet. Not the polite, this must be a VIP quiet, the other kind. The kind where people didn't look up because they instinctively understood that looking might cost them something. Rosalie looked up anyway. There were 2 men. The one in front was taller than anyone had reasonable cause to be inside an accounting firm. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than Rosalie's monthly rent, which in Montreal was already unconscionable. His hair was dark, shot through with grey at the temples, and pushed back from a face that looked like it had been designed by someone with strong opinions about jaw structure. He was somewhere north of 40, built like a man who still did something physical and didn't feel the need to mention it. His eyes were a cold, glacial grey, the kind of grey that wasn't ambiguous. It was a decision. The man behind him was younger, compact, and had the expression of someone professionally paid to stand slightly to the left and look unfriendly. Taya, at reception, made a small noise Rosalie could only describe as a suppressed wheeze. "I have an appointment," the man in the overcoat said. His accent was Quebecois underneath a layer of something older, something European and deliberate. "Castian Vrel, 2 o'clock. It was 11:15. Taya did not point that out. Rosalie returned to her screen. She knew the name. Everyone in certain circles of Montreal knew the name, the way you knew the names of weather systems and tax audits. Things that could flatten you if you weren't paying attention. Castian Vrel was officially a real estate developer and private equity investor. He owned 3 buildings in the Plateau, a vineyard in Dunham, and a logistics company in Laval, whose clients had a remarkable tendency not to appear in public records. He was also, by every credible whisper that moved through the city's financial underground, the operating head of what remained of the Vrel network, a quiet, vicious organization that had controlled import infrastructure through the port of Montreal for 30 years. His father had built it. Castian had inherited it, rationalized it, and made it so efficient that the authorities had been chasing receipts for a decade and finding nothing but clean paper. Bernier and Croft did not typically handle clients like this. Bernier and Croft's senior partner, Michelle Croft, was currently standing in the reception area, wearing the expression of a man who had agreed to something 3 months ago and was only now registering its full implications. "Mr. Vrell, welcome. The meeting room is just being prepared if you'd like." "I'll sit," Castian said, already moving toward the chairs by the window. He sat. His associate remained standing. The office continued to pretend nothing was happening, while clearly doing nothing else. Rosalie had gone back to her screen, but she was running 2 processes simultaneously now. The discrepancy in column G and the quiet, cold pressure of someone's gaze on the side of her face. She didn't turn. 2 minutes passed. "You," said a voice that carried like it was used to rooms with better acoustics than this. In the corner, the one with the fern. Rosalie slowly swiveled her chair. Castian Vrell was looking directly at her, not at Taya, not at Michelle, who was hovering anxiously nearby, at Rosalie. "Is there a problem?" she said. Her voice came out steady. She was privately surprised. "Your spreadsheet," he said. "It's wrong." The office went even quieter, which Rosalie hadn't thought was possible. She looked at her monitors, then back at him. "You're 15 feet away." "Column D," he said. "The variance in your row summary doesn't account for the compounded interest on the secondary line. You're out by about $4,000. Rosalie turned back to her screen. She looked at column D. She was out by $4,012. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You read financial discrepancies from 15 feet like other people read menus." "I read everything," Castian Vrell said. "It's kept me alive." Michelle Croft laughed nervously. Nobody else did. Rosalie corrected the formula, saved the file, and turned back to face the room. "Meeting room 3 is available now, Mr. Vrell. I'll let Michelle take it from here." She turned her chair back to her monitors. "I want her in the meeting," Castian said. Michelle blinked. "Rosalie is our internal reconciliation specialist. She doesn't typically." She caught a discrepancy in her own work, corrected it in under 10 seconds, and didn't apologize for it. Castian was still watching her back. "I want her in the room." Rosalie heard this. She kept her expression neutral as she stood, picked up her notepad, and walked to meeting room 3 without looking at him. She told herself it was professional. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Castian Vrell wanted to restructure the reporting architecture for his property holdings. On paper, a legitimate and moderately complex task. Rosalie sat across from him and said little, took notes, asked 2 questions that made Michelle go slightly pale because they were the exact right questions, and they both knew it. Castian answered them without blinking. At one point, his associate, who had introduced himself as nothing and remained standing near the door the entire meeting, leaned in and murmured something in French. Castian replied in a low, even tone that Rosalie caught the edges of. He was telling the man to back the car around to the side entrance. Logistics. Nothing alarming. What was alarming was the moment near the end of the meeting when Castian set down his pen and looked at Rosalie directly. "You're not taking notes on what I'm saying," he observed. "You're taking notes on what I'm not saying." The room temperature dropped slightly. Rosalie looked at her notepad. "I'm noting the structural inconsistencies between your declared asset timeline and the filing dates on 3 of your subsidiaries. There's a gap that will attract attention during a standard audit." Michelle made a small sound. Castian's glacial eyes didn't move. "And what would you recommend?" "A phased amendment filing, backdated correctly, with supporting documentation that closes the gap without triggering a secondary review." She paused. "Which I assume you already knew. I assume you came here to see if anyone on our team knew it too." For a long moment, Castian Vrell said nothing. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile. It was more like the acknowledgement that a smile was theoretically possible. "You'll be the one handling our account," he said. Rosalie opened her mouth, Michelle said. Absolutely, before she could. She walked back to her desk, sat down, looked at Gerald the Fern, and said quietly, "This is your fault, somehow." It started simply enough. Once a week, Castian's team would send over files, and Rosalie would review them, flag concerns, prepare reports. Straightforward, if sensitive. She was meticulous. She built a wall between what she knew and what she was allowed to know, which was a skill she had developed over years of working adjacent to industries that preferred not to be examined closely. But Castian Vrel did not stay on his side of the wall. The second time he came in person, he arrived exactly on time. He brought coffee, 2 cups, both from the place on Mackay Street, which was across town and not convenient for anyone coming from his office in Westmount. Rosalie stared at the cup he set on her desk. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I know," he said, and sat down in the client chair across from her. "I also didn't ask to be kept waiting on the Tremblant filing. But here we are." The Tremblant filing had 2 sets of conflicting numbers because someone on your team entered the same transaction twice under different subsidiaries. I fixed it. It took time because I did it correctly. She pulled up the file and turned her monitor so he could see. "If you'd like to explain to me why there are 4 different legal entities involved in what appears to be a single property transfer, that would save us both about 3 hours. Castian looked at the screen, then he looked at her. "Has anyone ever told you," he said slowly, "that you argue like someone who's never been afraid of anyone in her life?" "I'm afraid of plenty of things," Rosalie said. "I'm not afraid of a confused spreadsheet." She picked up the coffee. "Or of you." Something shifted in his expression. Too fast, too controlled. But she caught it. She catalogued it and moved on. The week after that, she overheard 2 of her colleagues talking in the kitchen. She was around the corner, invisible in the way she had learned to be, rinsing her mug. "Did you see the Vrel file on her desk, 3 inches thick?" "She's going to be managing it solo," Michelle told me. "Of course she is. What else is she going to do? It's not like she has anything else going on." A pause, and then lower, with the particular cruelty that hides behind a laugh. "I mean, look at her. Who else is going to walk into her office on purpose?" Rosalie stood at the sink for a moment. Her hands were still. She had heard versions of this her whole life. The implication that her competence was a consolation prize for everything else she supposedly lacked. That she was tolerated rather than chosen. That any attention paid to her was transactional at best. She dried her hands. She went back to her desk. She worked. But that night, unlocking the door to her apartment on Avenue de Lorimier, she sat on the floor of her hallway for a little while, her back against the wall, because sometimes even the most solid armor needed a minute. 3 days later, Castian Vrel arrived without an appointment. Michelle was at lunch. Taya buzzed him through because nobody said no to Castian Vrel. He walked to Rosalie's corner desk and set down a sealed envelope. "The Galano file," he said. "It needs eyes today." Rosalie looked at the envelope. "I have 3 other clients ahead of you." "I know." He didn't move. "I'll wait. It could be 4 hours." "I've waited longer for things that mattered less." She stared at him. He returned the look with the patience of a man who had never once been in a hurry because the world had always rearranged itself around him. She took the envelope. He sat in the client chair across from her desk for the next 3.5 hours. He made 2 phone calls in French, spoke in undertones, reviewed documents on his own tablet, and at no point asked her any questions or interrupted her work. He simply occupied the space near her like it was somewhere he had decided to be. At 4:15, she finished the preliminary review, flagged 2 concerns in writing, and slid the summary across the desk. He read it. Stewed. "You eat," he said. It was not entirely a question. "All humans eat," Rosalie said. "It's one of our defining features. There's a place on Rue Notre Dame. The chef does a tasting menu on Thursdays." He was putting on his overcoat. "I have a reservation at 7. "That sounds like your business," Rosalie said. "I'm making it yours." She looked up at him. The overhead lighting was not flattering to anyone, but Castian Vrel somehow remained composed under it, as if he had made a private agreement with the fluorescent tubes to leave him alone. "Why?" she asked. Not flirtatious, not performative, a genuine question, carrying the weight of someone who had learned to ask it before assuming. He held her gaze. "Because you are the most competent person in this building. You caught my error from 15 feet away. You have argued with me twice without flinching, and you looked me in the eye when everyone else in this city looks at the floor." He paused. "And because you deserve a meal that didn't come from a vending machine on the 14th floor." Rosalie said nothing for a long moment. "I'll have to go home and change," she said finally. "I know," he said. She went home. She stood in front of her closet for longer than she wanted to admit, because Rosalie Fontaine had a complicated relationship with her own body that she had been quietly negotiating for years. She owned beautiful things, but she didn't always feel beautiful in them. She chose a deep green wrap dress she'd bought in a moment of optimism and never worn, flats she could walk in, and absolutely zero apologies. Dinner was, objectively, extraordinary. The restaurant was small, warm, unpretentious despite its reputation. Castian Vrel was different without his associate standing guard. Not softer, exactly, but less defended. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He did not look at her like she was a curiosity. He looked at her like she was a primary source. She told him about growing up in Trois-Rivières, about the aunt who had given her a calculator for her 9th birthday and said, "You have a mind like a trap. Use it." About the years she had spent making herself quiet and small because it was safer than being noticed for the wrong reasons. He was quiet for a moment after that. "You're not small," he said. He wasn't talking about her body, or maybe he was, and it meant something else entirely in his voice. Something like, "You are abundant. You are more than sufficient." She didn't know what to do with that, so she ate another bite of the duck confit and said, "You were going to tell me about the Laval operation." He laughed, genuine, startled, low. It sounded like something that didn't happen often. "Not tonight," he said. "Someday," she said. "Someday," he agreed, like it was a promise. It was 12 days after that dinner that everything went wrong. Rosalie arrived at the office on a Wednesday morning to find 2 men she didn't recognize sitting in the waiting area. They were not the kind of men who came to accounting firms. They had the particular stillness of people accustomed to waiting in the kinds of places where waiting was a job function. Thea was stiff behind the desk, her eyes wide. "Messieurs Fontaine!" He stood too fast. Rosalie stopped walking. "Who's asking? We're associates of Mr. Duroche," the man said. Pierre Duroche was the name that surfaced whenever someone needed a word for the other half of Montreal's criminal infrastructure. The half that was not the Vrel network, the half that had been losing ground for 5 years and was not accepting it gracefully. "He has some questions about certain files he believes you've been working on." Rosalie kept her voice even. "I work for Bernier and Croft. Client files are confidential. We're not really interested in the files," the second man said. He had a smile that didn't land on his face properly, like it had been assembled from a description. "We're interested in what you know and who you've been talking to." She understood then. She was not a target because of her own importance. She was a target because of whose work she knew, whose numbers she carried in her head, whose structural gaps she had closed, whose name had been sitting in the client chair across from her desk for 3.5 hours on a Thursday afternoon. "I think you should leave," Rosalie said. The first man stepped toward her. "I think," said a voice from the doorway, quiet and entirely without inflection, "that you should reconsider that step." Castian Vrel stood in the entrance to Bernier and Croft Financial Services in a black overcoat, his associate behind him. He was not holding anything. He didn't need to. He had the calm of a man standing in his own territory, and the implication of that calm was sufficient. The 2 men looked at each other. "Vrel," the first one said, trying to hold the words steady. "Walk out," Castian said. "Both of you now. Tell Duroche that the next time he sends someone into a building full of civilians to threaten a private citizen, I'll consider it a direct communication to me, and I'll respond accordingly." He let the silence do the rest of the work. They left. The office exhaled. Castian walked to Rosalie's desk. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face carefully, the way you inventory something you're afraid might be damaged. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were less so. He saw the hands. He didn't comment on them. Instead, he said, "Come with me. I have work, Rosalie." It was the first time he had used her first name without the professional context around it. It landed differently. She took her coat from the back of her chair. His car was outside. His associate drove. Castian sat beside her in the back and said nothing, which was its own kind of language. After several blocks, she said, "How did you know they were there?" "I pay attention to what moves around you," he said, simply, as though this was not remarkable, as though the notion of someone tracking the peripheral world around her, not to control it but to protect it, was just a reasonable thing a person did. She sat with that for a moment. "You can't just, 'I'm not yours to protect,'" she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not mine." He looked out the window at the grey Montreal afternoon, the slush-edged streets, and the old stone buildings sliding past. "But I'm yours to use, if you'll allow it." Rosalie looked at his profile. He was not, she thought, a man who said things like that often. Or ever. "That's a strange way to put it," she said. "I'm a strange man. You're a crime lord who came to an accounting firm and corrected my column. Die, you'd have caught it yourself in another 30 seconds. 45, she admitted. He turned then and looked at her with those grey eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was nothing in them that was performing anything. No calculation, no distance, no management of perception. Just him, looking at her. "I've spent 20 years being the most dangerous thing in any room I walk into," he said quietly. "And I have never once met someone who made me feel like." He stopped. He was not a man who searched for words, which made it more significant that he was searching now, like "I would rather be seen than feared." Rosalie didn't say anything. Outside, a thin snow had started. February in Montreal unrelenting. "I told you I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said finally. "I remember. I'm afraid," she said carefully, "that someone like you might look at someone like me and see a novelty. Something interesting until it isn't." She looked at her own hands, the broad knuckles, the ink smudge she could never quite get off her right index finger. "I have spent a long time being the person who is very useful and not particularly desirable." The word cost her something. He heard it. "Then the people in your life," Castian said, with a flatness that was not cold but final, "have been categorically wrong." She looked at him. "You are not a novelty," he said. "You are the only person in this city I cannot predict. You argued with me the first time we met. You charged me for the tremblant hours at the standard rate when you could have billed double, and I would have paid it. You know things about my operation that could ruin me, and you've never once used them." He paused. "You are the most genuinely powerful person I know. You simply haven't noticed yet." Rosalie sat in the leather back seat of a car that probably cost more than her education in a city covered in February snow, and felt something she could only describe as a seam splitting open, not painfully, but like the first breath after a long time of holding one. The Duroche situation did not resolve quietly. 3 nights later, Rosalie was walking home from the dépanneur on Rachel Street, a bag of groceries in each hand and her earbuds in, when a car slid beside her. She knew before it stopped. She had been doing threat assessment her whole life. She just hadn't known that was what it was called until recently. She dropped the grocery bags. She grabbed the door handle of a parked car, swung herself around behind it as the first man got out, and screamed. Not from fear, from intention, loud, sustained, directional. Because it was February, and there were people in the restaurant across the street with their coats on and their phones out. And Rosalie Fontaine had lived in this city for 7 years, and she knew her neighborhood. A man came out of the restaurant. Then 2 women, the car that had stopped, began to pull away. But not before the man who had gotten out took a step toward her and then stopped. Because Rosalie had picked up her heavy canvas grocery bag from the pavement and was holding it with the kind of grip that made it very clear she intended to use it. "You want to do this," she said, her voice absolutely level. "In front of 12 witnesses and a restaurant with a camera on the awning?" He looked at the camera. He looked at the people watching. He got back in the car. Rosalie stood on the sidewalk on Rachel Street until the car turned the corner. Then she picked up her second bag, nodded once to the people watching from across the street, and walked home. Her hands were shaking by the time she got to her door. She put the groceries away. She sat on her kitchen floor. She called Castian. He answered on the second ring. She told him in 12 sentences what had happened. He was silent for 4 seconds, which she had come to understand was a long time for him. "Are you home?" he said. "Yes. Don't open the door for anyone until you hear from me." "I'm not incompetent," she said. "I know you're not," he said, and his voice had something in it that made her chest hurt. "I know that better than anyone. But let me do this one thing. Please." She let him. He arrived 2 hours later. Not alone, but he came to the door himself, which she hadn't expected. He looked at her face in the way he'd looked at her in the car. Careful, cataloguing, afraid of what he might find. "You're unharmed," he said. "I'm unharmed," she confirmed. He exhaled. It was for Castian Vrel the equivalent of collapsing. "I handled the Duroche situation," he said. It was not a sentence that invited follow-up questions, and Rosalie had learned to recognize those. "It won't happen again." "I know," she said. "I handled it first." His eyes moved over her face. "You did," he said, "with a bag of groceries and a camera," she pointed out. "Logistics matter." He stepped into her small, warm hallway. The overhead light was soft. He was in a dark coat and he looked, for just a moment, in her apartment hallway, without the weight of the city pressing in on him, like a person. "I need to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I came to your office that first morning because Croft owed me a favor, and I needed eyes I could trust." That was all it was supposed to be. He wasn't looking away. What it became was not something I planned. "What I feel," he stopped. He was doing that thing again, searching for words, and it was excruciating in the best possible way to watch. "I'm not a man who performs feeling. I don't know how. What I can tell you is that I've arranged my entire day around the 40 minutes you spend reviewing my files. I have taken meetings across town specifically to have a reason to come back through the plateau. I bought coffee from a place on Mackay Street because you once mentioned it in passing and I was paying attention." Rosalie looked at him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "From the first day," he said, "to everything." She had spent 31 years building the careful, reasonable belief that she was not the woman someone moved the world for, that she was the one who made things work quietly, competently, invisibly. That love, real, unambiguous, look at her love, was for people who came in different packaging. She was reconsidering. "I'm not going to disappear into your world," she said. "I'm not going to become someone who belongs to you and stops belonging to herself." "I know," he said immediately, not as a concession. "As a fact, I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep arguing with your column D. I'm going to bill you at standard rate, because you can afford it and the principle matters. Understood? And," she said, "if you ever, once, look at me the way those men at the restaurant looked at me, like I'm something to be commented on, or dismissed, or found funny, I will personally reconstruct your entire financial architecture and leave the gaps exactly where they'll hurt the most." For a moment, Castian Vrel, king of Montreal's grey economy, organizer of 30 years of invisible infrastructure, man who had not once bent his knee to anyone, looked at Rosalie Fontaine in her hallway and smiled. A real one, finally, unhurried and unguarded. "I have never," he said, "looked at you any way other than exactly how you are." She held out her hand, not for him to hold. She offered it palm up. An accounting gesture, a "here is what I have. Take stock of it" gesture. He took it in both of his. He pressed his mouth against her knuckles, not performatively but with a focused, quiet reverence, the way you treat something you intend to keep. "Then we can talk about the Laval operation," Rosalie said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight," she said. He looked at her. "I'll make tea," she said. "You can start from the beginning. I have questions about the 2019 filing, and I've been too professional to ask them." He sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she ate dinner alone most nights, where Gerald the Fern's smaller cousin sat on the windowsill, and he started from the beginning. And Rosalie Fontaine, who had spent her whole life being invisible by choice and overlooked by accident, pulled out her notepad and listened, and asked the exact right questions, and did not look away. She had built her armor from numbers and silence and careful small footprint living. It turned out armor could be rebuilt, out of better materials, by someone who had finally decided she was worth the work.